Putin's tenure has frankly been a disaster for Russia. If you consider that at the start of his, sort of taking office, Putin was seen as a man who might well bring Russia into the international community, play a leading role, be responsible, be a partner with other countries. All that's been, torn to shreds by his behavior over the last, sort of 15 years and 16 years in particular. So, from those bright hopes and the possibilities for Russia, which could have been an integrated trading nation, being part of the security architecture of the world, what you've had instead is an isolated, kind of aggressive country trying to overturn the security order and becoming ever more isolated as a result. And amidst that, seeing the myth of its military power being exposed ruthlessly by a much smaller country on the ground. So, if you were to take stock of that period, Russia's prestige has tremendously gone down. Its isolation has increased. Its abilities have been shown to be weak. It's not much of a legacy for someone who's been around for that longer period. Vladimir Putin, for some time, has clearly been adopting the model of, I want to, reconquer, as it were, the parts of the Soviet Empire that were lost with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he's spoken about this, he's written about this. We know that's been his sort of ambition for some time. Unfortunately, I think what he hasn't realized is that contemporary Russia is not the Soviet Union. It isn't what it was, post Second World War, as a real legitimate superpower. The economic base of Russia is weak. It doesn't, have much diversity in terms of its industries and its trades. And as such, anything he wants to build on is really only on the petrochemical, sort of bonanza. And so for that to be effective, he needed to be open to the rest of the world. He needed to be a trading nation to secure the benefits of Russia's natural resources. And by hearkening back to Soviet times in terms of trying to recreate that empire, what he's done is shut off Russia from the world, in a sense, exactly what happened to the Soviets. If you think about the way that trade between West and East was very restricted during Cold War days, the difference is, of course, that the world's moved on a lot since Cold War days, and Russia does not have the power the Soviet Union had, either militarily, frankly, or from the point of view of economically. Well, although the Soviets were, never a major economy in the sense of a Western major economy, they at various times they had great industrial productivity and other points. So he doesn't have that, and he doesn't have the base from which to sort of grow on. And as a result, it's been in chasing his sort of nostalgic dream, he has indeed exposed Russia to ridicule. And it would have been better to have tried to pursue that dream through diplomacy, to try and encourage people, in his region, to be friendlier with Russia, but through, the carrot rather than the stick. But he didn't do that. He chose the stick, and it hasn't worked out very well for him as a result.
It's been a project, and the project has gathered pace as his rule has progressed, and it's been accelerated hugely by the beginning of the full-scale war on Ukraine. It is bringing Russia back to its historical comfort zone and Putin's historical comfort zone, not so much a recreation of the Soviet Union, although it's got features of the late Soviet Union that Putin is trying to reinstall, but more those traditional, permanent features of Russia, the repression at home, verging from authoritarianism into totalitarianism and accelerating in that direction as well, the aggression abroad, the revival of Russian imperialism, all of these things which are constants for the country throughout history, and from which the period after the end of the Cold War, which Putin inherited, were an anomaly. So he has been busily engaged in, as far as he sees it, and as many Russians see it, putting things right by putting Russia back to the state that he thinks it should be in, both at home and abroad.
Well, I think he's been a catastrophe for Russia. He's been a complete disaster for Russia and for the Russian people. And the Kursk incursion, however long it lasts, has shown that despite all his propaganda and his bluster and, sitting there at his desk with his telephone, seeming to be Mr. Cool and, able to blow the world up if he wants at a button, actually, he is like all bullies, far less powerful than he appears to be if challenged. And that's the really important thing. So he's been a disaster. Economically, Russia is on its knees, and it will take 20, 30 more years, if the war were to end tomorrow, before Russia would be able to find its way back to where it was in 1999. I would also say, I mean, I have to almost confess, Putin remains a man of mystery to me. I mean, those of us who look at him closely, and I mean physically look at him, detect almost no changes. I mean, from time to time, I've commented on his cheeks being puffed up. I'm convinced that he has a body double or body doubles. I'm convinced of that.
One thing Putin's been very successful at is propagandizing his positions within Russia. There is no doubt that there is some popularity for him in Russia, and people have felt that he was restoring sort of a tarnished luster to Russia, which it had lost at the end of the Soviet Union period. And of course, at the very beginning of times, let's not forget, Putin did help stabilize the Russian economy. He sort of did, in his early years, there were some benefits to the Russian people. And historically, the Russians never been that concerned about, human rights being, cracked down. I'm not saying that lightly. I think there is there's definitely a category of Russian who accepts that as, being a form of autocracy that's been as old as Russia itself. So look, he's got that propaganda element, but I think slowly, people are realizing that beneath it, there's really very little beyond his bluster. And I think things like this invasion that's currently going on of Russia by Ukraine cannot but reduce his and diminish his authority in the eyes of Russians. And far from him being a great czar, he's increasingly going to be seen as a clown-like figure. And frankly, although there is popularity there, anyone who has to rig election after election, anyone who has to scare off or imprison the democratic opposition in order to be certain of their victory, you have to question how popular Putin really is. Because if he was truly popular, it wouldn't matter who was against him, he'd be able to win a free and fair election. So the very fact that's not happening tells you that, yes, I'm sure Mr. Putin still has a constituency within Russia. Whether it's a majority, that is very much debatable. And in fact, it might well be the case that were there to be a free and fair election, he'd be swept from power and gone quite quickly.
Putin, for me, remains what he always was, the highly effective, highly efficient KGB professional who gets his way with persistence through a mixture of violence and threats.
I think Mr. Putin's plan, frankly, will be to govern as long as possible. And rather, we say that he's getting old. Well, there are many examples of dictator-like characters in the world who rule to their late 80s or early 90s. What really matters is if you've got control of your security forces and the internal policing situation and the armed force. If you have control of those, you can be 100 and, barely compos mentis and still be in power. I think Mr. Putin's very aware of one thing in particular, which is the minute he leaves office, he will be fair game for whoever comes after him. And he's made a lot of enemies domestically, but also internationally. There is no way that he'll want to end up either in The Hague, in the dock in The Hague, or at the end of an assassin's bullet, because he didn't take the right precautions and allowed someone else to take power. I see no evidence that he's planning to leave office. I think the constitution allows him to run until the mid 2030s, and I'm pretty sure he intends to fill that term. Now, it could be that illness crops in. It could be that he does find someone he can trust. I mean, historically, obviously, the way that dictators try and resolve this is by choosing family members to succeed them. Now, whether there is somebody in the extended Putin family who can take over, no one's come to mind so far, but perhaps down the line there will be. Maybe that's what he's waiting for. But it is, there certainly does not appear to be any successor in the wings. And in fact, the people closest to Putin are his age or older. So I'm not sure that any transfer of power to them voluntarily would make any difference to the longer term trajectory of Russia. The question really is, how long can Putin hold control over the whole apparatus of power in Russia? Will he be removed by internal forces, or will Russians finally have enough and remove him by some kind of revolution? Now that's all unclear at the moment. There's no signs of the latter happening. Whether the former happens, of course, does, I think, increasingly hinge on the success of this war in Ukraine. The longer this drags on, the more it seems that Putin's on the defensive, the more people might start to say internally, the old man's had his time, it's time to find someone else. And the moment those chatterings start, that's when there's a moment of danger from a coup within.
I don't think there's any reason to think that to assume that he is going to consider at some point that he is too old to hang on to power and has to give it up, because that's traditionally throughout Russian history, decisions like that have been fatal. And the exceptions to the rule are under very specific circumstances, like when Yeltsin hands over to Putin with the guarantees that he's not going to be prosecuted for anything afterwards. Now, it shouldn't be ruled out that Putin may be preparing some kind of handover like that preserves both his life and his family's lives and the amount of money that he's raked off over his entire official career. But that's a complicated operation, and we should equally not be surprised if the only way Putin leaves the Kremlin is feet first, even if that comes after a period of ineffectiveness and senility, as we've also seen from previous Soviet leaders in the past. It'll only create a power vacuum if Putin has planned extremely poorly, because he will want there to be a stable transition of power under whatever circumstances he leaves office, precisely for those same reasons. He's got family, he's got money, he's got a legacy that he wants to look after, he's got people that he needs to take care of. So a disorderly transition of power works against that. No, there won't be moves to seize democracy, because there's nobody to do that. There is no liberal opposition. And in terms of who might be seeking to seize power, it has to be somebody that doesn't have a vested interest in the system remaining stable. And that's where Yevgeny Prigozhin was the exception to the rule, because he was outside that stable pyramid of power. He had that unique combination of having power in the form of a private army, but also not being beholden to the stability of the system, so he could disrupt it from the outside. There aren't any other people who are in that same position.
Well, I've often said I actually don't think Putin is right in his head. I think to do all the things that he's doing, I think he's got to be cracked. But I think it is also noteworthy that there is no sign of him in public building up a successor to himself. When we saw these changes after Prigozhin, we thought it's possible some of these people are on their way up to succeed Putin. But no, nobody has been able to assume a profile. Putin still wants to be seen as the person who is running everything. There's no rival, nobody waiting in the wings. It's him. It's Putin or nobody. And that too is characteristic of an obsessive, almost a mental attitude towards political power, that it's got to be me, nobody else can do it, which of course is nonsense. Nobody else can do it. It's got to be me, and everything is about Putin's ability to kind of project himself as the spirit of Russia, the essence of Russia, the essence of Russian history.
The war in Ukraine, as long as it serves his purpose of staying in power, he will continue it. The moment it begins to threaten to destabilize it, I think he will move to end that war with some kind of ceasefire. Because he's able to spin most things to the Russian people, the end of that war doesn't really matter how it ends. He will be able to spin it as a victory, whether he gets 1 centimeter of territory in Ukraine or, several hundred miles, whatever it is. He will be able to spin it as a victory. The one thing he might not be able to spin as a victory is if Ukraine holds Russian territory. That will be very difficult to work out. And that, of course, would mean that he might be fair game for dismissal or removal internally if a coup happens there. If you take part of Ukraine, much like Hitler took the Sudetenland in 1938 and then moved into Bohemia and Moravia in Czechoslovakia, your next chance is to grab the diminished country that you've already taken bits of. So that's an obvious first target. But yes, he could go further. Much depends on how this war progresses, how it ends, how involved the West gets, and what he feels his approach might be. The one thing that's going to prey on his mind, though, is that the Russian army is clearly not up to major combat operations, and it's having difficulty enough with the Ukrainian military to take on proper Western militaries, which have been tooled and trained for some time. That's a very different, kind of proposition.
Unfortunately, the direction of travel is pretty clear. And one thing that is very striking about the assessments of Putin's next moves that we hear right across Europe and the United States and North America from defense ministers, chiefs of defense, intelligence chiefs, etc., all saying exactly the same thing, that if the situation in Ukraine is resolved or becomes more stable, whether it's through Russian victory or potentially even a ceasefire, then Putin's next target is one of the NATO countries. And the timescales that have been put on that range between 1 and 5 years, depending on who you're talking to. So if that is true, and there don't seem to be many people disagreeing with it at the moment, then Putin's future is war with NATO, for which, of course, he's spent his entire time in office preparing. The November election is the reason why Putin won't launch a war against NATO tomorrow, because there is no reason to fight for something today that might be handed to you on a plate after November. If Trump gets in, he's made very clear his intent to cut support to Ukraine and also to call into question the US commitment to security in Europe overall. So suddenly, Putin's self-appointed task becomes very much easier because he doesn't have the Americans standing in his way. So why mess that up now when you might actually just be receiving a gift after November?
I mean, he's a war criminal. He's an indicted war criminal. In a way, we don't need the indictment. We can see with our own eyes what he does. We can see his threats. We can see the continued violence, and he will be violent again when it comes to raining missiles, North Korean missiles, Zelensky has said. Again, that's very significant because it shows that Russia by itself, it can't hack any of this. It needs this axis of evil, China, North Korea, Iran, to sustain its war. It cannot manage it by itself.